Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Insights at Questrom and our exciting discussion today. I'm Pete Howard, Executive Director of the Digital Business Institute here at the Boston University's Questrom School of Business. Our topic today is an exciting one. Can politicians win votes by telling the truth? Very timely topic and intriguing title. First, a little housekeeping. We'd love to have an active Q&A with everybody. So here's how it works. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and I will moderate them after we get through some of our discussion. So with us today, we had advertised Professor Nina Mazar, but unfortunately she's out ill. But we have Professor Marshall Van Alstyne and Barrett Golding. So Barrett Golding is the founder and executive producer of Hearing Voices from NPR, which was launched in March 2008, and it's now radio's largest independent producer consortium. Crossing Borders, its series of stories by Mexicans and Mexican Americans, won a Peabody Award in 2007. Barrett also manages Iffy News, which creates tools for mis and disinfo for researchers. Very timely to our topic today. Marshall Van Alstyne is the Allen and Kelly Questrom Professor in Information Systems here at Questrom, one of the world's foremost experts on network business models, and the co-author of the international bestseller Platform Revolution. He conducts research in information economics, covers such topics as the economics of speech markets, platform economics, intellectual property, social effects of technology, and productivity effects of information. He has been a major contributor to the theory of two-sided networks taught worldwide and to the theory of platforms as inverted firms applied in antitrust law. His work has received more than 27,000 citations, includes a top 50 all-time article for Harvard Business Review, and is recognized by Thinkers 50 as among the most important management contributions globally. So our topic today is, can politicians win votes by telling the truth? Marshall, you've said politicians since at least the time of Plato have not been known for their probity. Could modern mechanism design help? Please take us into the discussion.
Well, we think they can actually. I don't know. I'd ask the question back. I don't know. Has there ever been a time when politicians have been known for their probity or known for their honesty? I don't know. It's certainly become more of an interesting challenge. I think Barrett will give us a little bit of interesting data afterwards. But give you a little bit of background. We're running a large National Science Foundation project to see what kinds of interventions we might be able to try, which would help with some of the misinformation in our information environments today, specifically some of the social media environments, or even some of perhaps the standard news media environments. And we think that we have some interventions that would be effective in curbing the flow of disinformation with no censorship at all and with no central authority judging truth. There are a couple of deep economic principles associated with that. But in conjunction with that, we then started running a couple of different studies. So we'll go down to a couple of different routes, but to give you the punchline from one of them, we took all of the statements of the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates as made during the debate, and we ran a regular experiment with a control. We ran it with one of our interventions. And we got the interesting result that compared to the control, the environment with our intervention in it actually convinced the neutral voters to increase their willingness to vote for one of the candidates who were willing to self-certify, who were willing to vouchsafe the validity of their claims by about 44%. It was a pretty big increase in the amount of their willingness to vote for one or the other candidate. I need to be honest, at the polar extremes, it had almost no effect. I was a little bit surprised and disappointed that it had less effect on the polarized extremes. But among those that were undecided, that component of it was rather effective in making a difference. I'd actually like to invite Barrett to speak up for a moment, because I think he's just released some interesting data on whether or not we're honest. So we have research on this about our particular intervention. We actually just gave a little bit of data on whether folks are more likely to vote for politicians that have a little bit more interesting or more honest background. So let me just invite Barrett to give some of the data that he provided as well.
Okay, well, first of all, I have to say I have an affinity to BU because my dad went there. And when I lived on Buswell Street around the corner, A friend went there and somehow he came up with an extra ID card that allowed me to get free meals in the dorm. So I ate free off you people for almost a year till the lunch lady said, "That ain't you." And that was it for that. So that's my BU connection. Thank
Are
you.
you
Turned
telling
out
us you're
great. So
using
was,
misinformation to take advantage of things?
Yes.
well, I was going to say he turned out great. So it was a good investment on BU's part.
It's a good investment of calories. So, yeah, I've been looking, this is the third time. The first was 2016, 2020, and 2024, looking at PolitiFact data and seeing if there's any correlation between the truthfulness of a candidate and the success of that candidate. And specifically, I looked at Senate candidates because there's enough there to get a reasonable amount of, a reasonable sample. Uh, but, where's the house? That's a lot of people. I have a life. I can't do that. And so, but I've done it three times now, and three times it's come out about the same, that the more truthful candidate is the more successful candidate. I basically turn PolitiFact gave me permission to use their data. I turned their ratings, false to true, with a pants on fire down below, into a 0 to 1, 0 being false. And so they have a score. I just aggregate the claims rated for any one person into a score, and then I can compare them by their score, and I can also compare groups of people. And so not just winners and losers, but incumbents who tend to be the winners or tend to be more truthful than the challengers. And even if you bust it down by, let's say, winning Republicans versus losing Republicans, that holds up. Winning Democrats versus losing Democrats. Now, that may be changing, I'd have to say. Since 2020, their general scores have gone down a bit, and that percentage even hit 50% in 2024. I do it two ways. The aggregate group of all the winners and the aggregate group of the losers. But then I also look at matchups. PolitiFact has not checked all the candidates. Maybe around 60, 65 of the candidates have at least one check. And so I look at the head-to-head matchup where a race has both candidates, they've both been fact checked. So that's where I am. It's like I was telling Marshall this morning, I'm not saying voters choose the most truthful candidate on purpose, or that they even know which is the most truthful candidate. I'm saying that their voting totals favor fact over fiction. Oh, I should post, it just came out. Here's in the chat is the
Great.
study.
Sure, the audience will appreciate it. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the numbers now. And first of all, it's pretty amazing. And to your point, so you don't have causality, right? It's just sort of correlated at this point. But, it is interesting looking at the incumbent total of 53% versus challenger 36%. I mean, I guess it's intuitive, but any other insights to why incumbents would have more or less incentive to be truthful or not?
Well,
I have
one hopes they're
insight.
going to win based on their records and what they're stating. And it was interesting. There does seem to be a bias in there, though. There's now a change. I thought if Barrett's original numbers of 2008, 75% of the time, the more honest candidate won, whereas 2024, 50% of the time, the more honest candidate won, which is basically a coin toss at that point.
It is.
Things had deteriorated from where they used to be.
From 2008 to 2018, that's, PolitiFact started in 2008, so that's where I started looking at their numbers. There was a high percentage from 2020 to now, in other words, the last three elections, has not been, I mean, in total, it's still above 50%, but it's a noticeable change since then. I don't know why. I don't make conjectures without at least, yeah, I'm not one, yeah, I don't make conjectures.
No, it's fascinating. So maybe back to you, Marshall. You mentioned the intervention. Can you take the audience through more detail of what is your intervention and then we'll get to kind of how it works in terms of accountability and the impacts.
Plus, a little
Absolutely.
more on that vouchsafe. What did you mean by that? How
So
was that conveyed to the subject?
absolutely. It's a great question. So let me give you two different sets of things. So one is the theory, and then we'll give you the specifics. Because we want to figure out what would a new theory be that would actually help solve these problems. And then there's a question about how you would implement it. So what I want to give you is here's the reasoning behind what we're trying to do, as well as the actual methods we use to test it. So I've been really worried about any form of censorship and trying to deal with misinformation. There's always this challenging question about who's going to decide the truth. So what we tried to do is to design a decentralized mechanism to solve that problem, as opposed to a centralized mechanism, whether it's the platform or whether it's a government or anything of that sort. What we've done is to view it as a pollution problem. That's a negative externality. This is damage that occurs off platform, whether this is damage that's global warming, whether it's loss of vaccination, whether it's shooting in pizza parlor, whether it's insurrection, whatever, or sex trafficking, drug trafficking. These are all damages not internalized by the platform. Now, usually when there's a pollution problem, you have government intervene and say, okay, you have to stop producing dioxin or you have to stop producing carbon dioxide. And so they restrict the amount of the carbon dioxide, what you do. But in the speech context, that's censorship. So we can't have government do it. There's a really deep set of principles by an economist by the name of Ronald Coase. He won the Nobel Prize partly on this basis. It's also possible to create decentralized markets so that you can, the choices of source and destination may be able to negotiate. Let me give you two examples, one negative and one positive, but both of them are information goods in a sense. When he originally designed his theories, one radio station might be broadcasting and interfering with the signal of an adjacent radio broadcasting station. And so what happens is each competes with the other and creates what? Interference, noise that makes it impossible to work. His idea was you create property rights and you trade it. So the scarce resource was the bandwidth. You'd sell it. One would buy it from the other. Government wasn't involved. If government would be involved, you say A gets to produce and B cannot produce. Same thing's true in intellectual property rights and a positive externality. We don't want the government saying Barrett can produce, invent and I can't. What you want to do is you want the inventors to create on their own and then trade it so that the party that can produce it in the most effective way actually does it, rather than having the government tell you. We try to do the exact same thing for speech. What we want to do is want to say, okay, suppose you're a listener on Facebook or TikTok or YouTube or what have you. Wouldn't you like to clean up your own pollution streams? You'd have your own filters, if you will. What that means, though, is that you could then choose from BBC or New York Times or Breitbart or Fox or any filter that you wanted. But you then create filter bubbles because you might only listen to those things that you wanted to hear. Then we ask the question, okay, how can we give you a right to be heard? There's no country in the world, not even the United States, that gives you the right to be heard. You have a right to speak, but you don't necessarily have a right to be heard. Now the question is, how do you balance this question of the right to be heard against the right not to hear? It's actually quite simple once you see it. You simply agree to exercise your right responsibly, and then you can actually insert your message in a way that others can then can hear it or evaluate it. You take responsibility for the message that you're going to impose on others that didn't want to hear it. Okay, that's the theory. What happens then is between source and destination alone, no government involved, no platforms involved. You then simply make a choice. Are you going to vouchsafe the validity of your message or not? If you do, you take responsibility for the consequence. In the experiment, we ran it in a really, really simple way, which is if I'm going to impose a message, I'm going to risk a nickel on an audience. And if I'm telling the truth, I get the nickel back. If I'm lying and anyone else can prove it, they get the nickel. Now I have to make a choice. If I know I'm lying, I don't want to risk the nickel. If I know I'm telling the truth, it's going to be free for me to then put my message out there in front of a different audience. We tested this with 1,500 social media users, and it worked like a charm in terms of the discernment. That is, we compared a control group that was analogous to a social network which did not have our intervenant, and you had the option to share a number of various news headlines, and we had pre-vetted these headlines for interesting and boring, and for true and false, equally populated across those. Lo and behold, with no intervention, folks shared more false information than true information. We then set up the experiment where we gave them the option. Again, this isn't a requirement, it's simply an option. You can be rewarded a nickel for sharing true information. Or actually, you could impose your message. Sorry, two different things. There's the speaker side and there's the listener side. On the speaker side, you could then have the message presented, and you would risk the nickel or not, and it would be presented or not based on your choice. Or you could share it without warranting it. Again, entirely your choice. What's fascinating is that the majority of folks chose to warrant the truth and actually impose the message. The engagement actually went up on this case, and the discernment went way up. That is, their willingness to share true information relative sharing false information was much, much higher than the other case. And again, totally voluntary. Beauty is on the flip side, what happened? We also tested among 2,000 recipients. If someone was willing to vouchsafe their message, how was it received? Did they believe it was more credible or less credible? And we found, unsurprisingly, that if they're willing to vouchsafe the message, that it was perceived as much more credible. So it went up substantially from that. In the other experiment we're talking about in the voting context, we took the comments made by Harris and by Walz and by Vance and by Trump, and we put the condition of a baseline control where there's no intervention, and we tried another one where the candidate had putatively vouchsafed the claims, and sure enough, we were able to shift votes if they're willing to vouchsafe their claims. So those are the two different things. One is the theory as to why this works. It's completely decentralized. You're willing to vouchsafe the claim. You're able to put a stake on it. And the question is, does it actually influence the votes? And actually, in our particular context, it did. So that was the mechanism.
Can I interject something I wrote up somewhere where I forget, but it was about a credibility score that could be applied on social media, And for instance, the basis would be, say we could evaluate the credibility of all the links that a person shared. And then again, score this thing. Yeah, all great links, they get a score of 100. All bad links, they get a score of 0. But the thing is, the user could decide whether they show that badge or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that is very similar. Now, of course, the users, some of them who don't want to show the badge are going to attack the rating system. But that can be addressed as well.
So
The ratings of the link system.
You've highlighted something that's really essential. It's about this difference between this and a lot of the other mechanisms. Who knows whether the message is true or not better than the author of the message? It's certainly not the recipient. So, something like the Mark Zuckerberg plan of, let the users decide, means that, 1,000, 10,000 people may each having to make their own decision, as opposed to vetting it once from the author's perspective. We're also using signaling and screening economics. The signal comes from the person who knows the truth. They're the author of the message. So they can voluntarily signal they're telling the truth. It's a very simple screening mechanism that the recipient can use. Geez, are they willing to commit to telling the truth in a way that's actually going to bind? That's an interesting question. We've shifted the burden to the source, not the destination.
Exactly. And right now, all the methods that I come across are claim related, topic related, and it's a constant fight. And, at Iffy News, there's other articles about this. I think once it got into social media, it's over. Those things are going to reoccur forever. Zombie claims, they call them. So it's really a source thing. Do you trust the source, whether it's a person or a news outlet or, a group or whatever? And that, to me, has far more promise than trying to, whack-a-mole all these individual claims, which just every time there's a disaster, there's going to be 20 fake claims. 2 of them are going to succeed. 10 of them are going to come from Russians who do this quite effectively and quite cheaply. and that is not fightable, I think. But source identification of source credibility, whether it's a politician, a news outlet, or a social media user, I think that has promise.
So, Peter, we have a question in the, I don't know if you want to handle it now or do you want to handle it later?
Well, we can jump to this. Well, actually, there's one comment in the question. The comment is Barrett has won my vote for telling the truth about his BU meals. So you warranted that truth right off the bat. But the other question is, did either experiment take into account the effect of false information? Do you think the threat that a speaker's true claims are disproven by false information would reduce their desire to participate?
So this is the answer to the first part is yes. So we actually, again, as a control, we actually had again a distribution of equally of half true, half false, and a distribution of interesting and boring in there. So we did actually control for that. And then the mechanism is one such that if it's proven, the adjudication process is then visible to everyone. And you're exactly correct that that would discourage liars from wanting to participate in this because their lies are effectively exposed to them. But if the audience is one that they need to reach in order to solicit votes, again, it's voluntary, so they would want to try to reach that audience. All we've done is made a mechanism that allows the honest types to differentiate themselves, to separate themselves from the dishonest types in a place where the listeners or the voters or the readers would want to be. So that's our way of hoping to deal with that. And again, making it all public and entirely voluntary.
You know, I guess a follow-up question for me on that is you mentioned a couple times, Marshall, about boring versus interesting and then false versus true. Hasn't it been shown that false can be more interesting? Right?
Oh, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. You actually highlight something that was kind of fun in this. So 2 points. On the baseline study, it is the case that in the social media context, folks shared more false information than true. And of course, we think the reason is that it's more interesting. And in effect, we think that's what social media are doing. They're effectively rewarding engagement. They're rewarding interest. They're rewarding likes and followers. And what was interesting from our perspective is that offering this other mechanism then really managed to change their behaviors in the direction of increased discernment. They reduced their falsity and they increased their truth in the proportion of what they shared. But the second thing was a wonderful surprise, and I have to give Aaron Nichols, who's the PhD student who just defended his thesis on this, for doing some analysis. It's not just profit maximizing. It's not just getting the best out. We think the mechanism actually made people think more carefully about their choices. So you could get rewarded for sharing interesting information and that was false. Folks, so we would reward you for sharing interesting false information just as in the social media context, and they still had that option. Once we offered the intervention as opposed to the control group, they would forego that option. They wouldn't share the interesting false information, even though they could earn a nickel. So on average, people would forego, in our experiment, it was like 3 cents out of 25. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't just the monetary rewards. They actually chose to be more careful. We think they would spend more time thinking about it. We think that it would engage more cognitive thinking in what they were doing and what they were deciding to share. So it actually had effects beyond the real desire just to share interesting stuff. We think it made people more thoughtful.
Wonderful. So a quick aside, and then we'll get to the other questions. I'm curious, I'm sure our audience is curious, for both of you, Barrett and Marshall, what journey took you to this place? I mean, Marshall, you're coming from a platform background. Now, we have the Platform Governance Research Lab, and you're doing some wonderful work with grants. And Barrett, I don't know your journey as well, but you're certainly in the mix in the middle of this truth versus fake news issue. Marshall, what was your path to get here?
Oh, well, I think that there was, two nudges from different directions. So one of them is, I have to say, I felt a little bit like an arms dealer. For the first, 10 years or so of this academic career, it's really been, how can we make the tools to make platforms more powerful? They become, in fact, so powerful, and now talking to regulators, how we stop them from becoming so powerful. So, they're doing all kinds of, mischief and damage. And if, you're familiar with, I guess it was Frances Haugen's whistleblowing testimony, they really, really have put profits over people. So we've been really trying to make those corrections. But the second component was then misinformation has become an incredibly serious problem, whether it's vaccinations or lynchings or sex trafficking or drug trafficking or misinformation about medical research. And so, I was trying to think originally as a computer scientist or as an economist of what kind of interventions we might have. I was having conversations with my father, who's a free speech scholar, and I kept coming up with solutions that just didn't work. And he basically said, look, these can't work. They're unconstitutional. You can't use any kind of centralized solution, certainly not from a government perspective. And although it's possible that a private enterprise, a Facebook, a TikTok, could do it because it's their private space, you still don't want a central authority judging truth. And so I struggled based on his push to try to design a completely decentralized mechanism. The idea is really trying to design something that even I, as the designer, couldn't tamper with. Could we reduce the flow of information in such a way there is absolutely no central authority at all doing it? It's just the choices of source and destination that leads to a reduction in the pollution problem with no one in the center judging truth. So it was really those two things. It was the platform economics together with a push to try to do something about misinformation in a completely decentralized fashion.
Benefit by your great work. Barrett, how did you come to Iffy News from NPR, or what was your journey?
Yeah, well, like you said, I worked as a public radio producer for most of my life, and towards the end, every radio effort has a web component, and as I worked on them, I'd work with engineers, developers, and then I became one myself, and that's when I was talking to RJI down at Mizzou and about developing some things for WordPress specifically that would help journalists. And I did a mentorship. No, what do they call it? Yeah.
Mentorship?
Yeah, I guess that's what they call it down there. I was down there for a year hanging out in Colombia. And I just got, because of who they are, they're very involved in journalism. People come from all over there. I got very interested in journalism. First, I got interested in the performance of news websites, which spoiler alert, they suck. They're horrible. It's really bad. I mean, it is really one of the biggest problems out there is that news sites suck. and everybody else is investing all kinds of money into making their sites fast, performant, accessible, beautiful. Not so much with 90% of the news sites. Why do they suck? I started to ask. And that's ad technology. The programmatic way that we buy ads for online.
Yeah.
And that got me interested in, okay, is there a difference between a machine identifiable difference between high credibility sites and low credibility sites? That was just one way I was looking at this. And when I built my data set of low credibility sites, I realized on my computer is the only vetted, up-to-date, because all these other people had tried it, but their links had rotted away. Most of the links were like gone. And on my computer was like the most current one. So I thought I'd share it. There goes Iffy News. And then I looked, just as things occurred to me, I looked at that. And
Yeah, I mean, you're so right with the intersection of programmatic and the quality or lack of news. I mean, look at some of the, traditionally wonderful sites. Even I'll call one out like Forbes.com, right? You go there and you can't even read things, right? There's so many ads
Right.
popping up. It's become a
And
pollution, as you
Forbes,
say, Marshall.
because of their use of contributors, is got to be identified as as not a credible source because
Yeah.
of that big, and right now I'm working with the Wikimedia people, and there's a huge overlap with what I'm doing and they're doing, and trying to inject credibility into the various, especially Wikidata and Wikipedia. So I have to say one more thing to derail discussion a little. I have come to believe, if not more than believe that the social media is not fixable. And there's two reasons. They are either unwilling or unable to fix it. Now, unwilling, we all understand the profit motive, right? We see that. Unable, there was a programmer, I forget his name, Carlos somebody, who said, we build complex systems and fool ourselves into thinking we can understand them. No one knows how X works. No one knows how Facebook works. No one knows how Twitter works. They know their individual places. I do not believe, and we have a history of them trying to address misinformation, and they really haven't put a dent in it. So I do not believe it's fixable. And this is just something I tell everybody. So I'm telling y'all,
So,
we need to prevent it from getting into social media. And how does it get into social media? Almost nothing. There are a lot of studies about this. Almost nothing goes viral without a push from mainstream media. We like
so
to think,
I'm
oh
more
yeah, come through.
optimistic.
Go ahead.
But Barrett, I'm actually more optimistic than that. And I think that there are maybe ways to make it happen. Let me suggest two possible routes. So one of these is the route of giving users control. So if it were the case that users could choose their own algorithm, so imagine on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok, you could choose your own filters. You might naturally, A, want to choose the filters that are more transparent or they're open source so that you would be clear on what they're doing to you or doing for you. You might also choose them because maybe they're sharing their ad revenue with you. The point there being that then cleans up your information stream. So that's, if we were to give users those rights, that might be one way to do it. The second thing is that some of the upstarts, and one of my personal favorites at the moment is Blue Sky, which seems to be a competitor to X Twitter. They're already starting to design a marketplace of algorithms where others could post algorithms and you could then choose your own filters. In my view, that's half the system of rights that we need. That's the listener's rights to clean up your filters. We now also just need to give you the speaker's rights to be heard. So I'd be optimistic that either the platform could grant those rights in the manner that Blue Sky is headed. It's not there, but it's headed. Or if we were to grant those rights via the legislature, then you get the speaker's rights and you get the listener's rights. Again, this is an expansion of right. It's not a contraction. In that case, the markets crack open and it should actually work. So I'm more optimistic that we can fix this. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's possible.
I mean, you're right, and those are interesting solutions. We have a 20-year history of social media. I haven't seen any progress towards any of that, and people like yourself have been working on it hard. But my big question is, what happens when Blue Sky actually exists as on the market, which it does not now? It has essentially rounding off 0 users, and but say in the future it has a few 100 million users, and some man-child, I don't know that this had ever happened, some man-child decides to buy it because say he's the richest man in the world. This is just an example out of nowhere. But say he's the richest man in the world and he likes it and he wants it and he buys it. We're back to square one.
Great question. Let me see if I can answer that and combine it with a question from our audience. Who would have incentive to set this up and maybe regulate something like this? So, as you're probably aware, our favorite man-child's, ex Twitter has been losing advertisers because of his particular moderation policies. Now, suppose that it were the case that users could choose their own filters. If that's the case, then kids might choose the Disney filter. The gun advocates might choose it might choose the Breitbart filter, or you could actually have the Cabot's filter. And then you might also have the BBC filter for news, whatever. My point there is you naturally get segmentation. That also makes advertising way easier because users have self-segmented
There we
into
go.
groups. What that means
Like that.
is that advertisers could come back to a platform where users had opted into the communities that they chose, as opposed to the ones that Manchild chose for them. Again, I think this is a possible way to make it happen.
Yeah, if you mix in the the business possibilities, I like that.
See, again, we've been trying to design systems of rights that work with the platform economics that might actually give a mechanism to make it happen.
So back to a couple questions. So here's one from Erica. And it gets to your warrant system, Marshall. Is there a danger of saying that you're telling the truth when you know you will lie because you have the money to pay if proven wrong? I'm trying to read this question. I'm not sure I'm getting it. In other words, oh, here it is. I guess the question is asking, is there a danger of saying you're telling the truth when you know you will lie because you have the money to pay for it if you're wrong? I'm not sure what the question is asking, but maybe you can react to that. Is it still worth it to pay for the
So
truth?
I've heard variations on this question. So let me see if I can rephrase it, which is, could a system like this advantage the really rich man-child who'd then be privileged to lie because he could simply afford it? My answer is, I don't think so. I think it would actually have the opposite effect for at least two, if not three reasons. So one is the adjudication process becomes public to everybody. So the fact that you had lied now becomes visible in a way that it's not visible presently. At the moment, what we have is just a system of argument. He said, she said, he said, she said, and there's no resolution. So we get resolution to make this happen. The second element is because you have the right to be heard in a way that you don't have now, you now gain the right cheaply to pierce filter bubbles. So if rich man-child is constantly lying and constantly paying the bill, other people can correct them by reaching that same filter bubble audience with facts, and it's cheap because they get their money back. When it's adjudicated, they were proven true and they get it back. The third element of it is actually if this is a properly functioning market, think of it in the same way. Suppose that you're trying to reach an audience and you keep making the same lie over and over and over again, saying, for example, the election was stolen despite 46 odd court cases proving the contrary. Then it should be exactly like an insurance market. If you keep running your car through a stop sign and hitting people, what happens to your insurance rates? They go up. So my third point is man-child is going to pay more and more and more and more each time. He's going to get proven wrong. Other people gain the right to prove him wrong. And it gets increasingly expensive to keep lying about the same set of facts. So my inclination is that a properly functioning system should correct exactly for that problem and not advantage the super rich.
If you extend that to YouTube, the content creators actually do get paid. And
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
people could make a
Yeah.
profit on telling the truth
Yep.
in your system.
Right.
In
Right.
fact, it's funny, we had from Rohit that comment. YouTube uses a similar system to allow creators to self-attest to the ad suitability of their videos, disclose controversial content. So
Mhm.
there is something perhaps happening there. It's more advanced than Facebook or Twitter or X. Marshall, I'm curious, who would regulate this warrant system?
Oh, the whole point is all you need to do is to create the systems of rights, and then they become self-enforcing. You simply enforce your own system of rights in the same way that you would a patent. If I give you a right to own your resource, then if someone abuses it, you can put an injunction against them. The same thing here. If you have a right to be heard or if you have a right not to hear, you simply enforce your right. And either the platform needs to grant it or we need a society to grant those rights. So the whole beauty is government enables the rights and then they become self-enforcing just using standard adjudication mechanisms. There is an interesting question from an anonymous attendee, and I think it's a legitimate question. So who handles the adjudication process? Doesn't this then just push the problem back to the adjudication? I think the answer there is you really all you have to do is make it sure that the adjudication itself is decentralized in order to get all the benefits. Let me give you really the trade-offs that you would want to think about. If you have any standard mechanism for a court case now, what do? It's a jury of your peers. It's decentralized. You have a random sample of citizens who then make the call on whether or not someone was guilty of a crime or not guilty of a crime. And it's decentralized. You don't want the government interfering in that. They're not choosing the candidates in there. The other thing that you're trying to balance is basically accuracy and legitimacy. If you want legitimacy, you sample more from peers. If you want accuracy, you sample either more from scientists or, again, you run decentralized experiments. One of the arguments I like to make, I don't care who votes on the coefficient of gravity. Anybody can test it on their own, totally decentralized. You need something that's a falsifiable Popperian hypothesis. Anyone can prove it on their own. Again, the point is it's decentralized, so you don't have a central choke point from which to steer the outcome. And that then makes it fair and efficient.
You get at something that in my world, what is truth? I really don't care what truth is. I only care what machine harvestable truth there is. And that really comes down to ratings agencies um, and fact checks. And usually the ratings agencies are doing fact checks too. So it really is fact checks. And fact checkers are being attacked right now. I think that's a good ploy on the people who are failing them, and they're making a dent in the credibility, the perceived credibility of fact checks. But fact checks, that is the basic source for me as to whether something's credible. Now, there's all kinds of mechanical Turk experiments that show that you give people a few bucks and they do about as well as fact checkers. So that holds promise too. Maybe all the way to this community notes idea, except that is not panning out. Well, there's no real data, but the quasi data is not showing. But anyway, the idea is, can a machine determine what truth is? If you decide on these fact checkers are are viable, and like you say, you can independently go and see their fact check. Yeah, I just want to interject that because that's really where I've been doing this for a long time, and right now, Media Bias Fact Check is really the only rating agency with public ratings,
Mhm.
and plus they give me permission to use them. The rest are like either not comprehensive enough or like NewsGuard. They're just proprietary. They're basically to go to ad networks and stuff. But we could expand that.
Yeah.
I say it like this. We can solve the misinformation problem. We've chosen not to.
Oh, I like that. So let me pick up on that and then share some research and then offer one or two ideas in answer to this and some other questions. So uh, there's some fun research by Pennycook and Rand, I think that you're pointing to, where crowds do pretty well in terms of actually converging to what the expertise might actually be. Fascinatingly, I think most folks don't know, they've already been using decentralized peer juries for lots of these kinds of questions in China. One of the reasons is that the judicial system isn't terribly reliable, and so the platforms themselves have had to invent mechanisms, and they vote on some things as simple as, as did they not deliver your rice in your order, or did you unfairly rate the restaurant? And they're using peer juries to handle those kinds of questions.
Hmm.
There's another interesting element which you raised, and I think there's a question raised among the audience. Well, what about half-truths? What do we do in the case when it's partially true, or they give you something that's true but grossly misleading? Well, let me fall back, one on the philosophical argument and then two on the practical. As a philosophical sense, we can't actually know absolute truth. I mean, we all know examples where humanity believed the earth was flat or that we're the center of the universe. Neither of those turned out to have been true. At some point in the future, you may learn an additional fact that invalidates what you thought you knew previously. As a practical matter, we've already dealt with this in the existing judicial systems. We certify facts to preponderance of evidence, clear and convincing, or beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you adjust the level of certainty that you want to the level of strength of the criterion that you have. As a practical limitation here, if you've certified something to an audience of 1,000 and it's half true, you get half the warrant back. If it's completely true, you get all the warrant back. I mean, some of the stuff that Barrett was doing in PolitiFact, they have this beautiful 5-point scale. I'm entirely happy to use that scale or any other reasonable scale and give half back. So if you're giving a half truth, you get half of it back. So I think that would be a practical way of dealing with it, and it would be analogous to the kinds of things that we've already used.
Hmm.
Now, Maria put in a question at the end. Seems really interesting. Manipulation and bribery. Is there a way to game? And we had another question earlier about gaming the system. So how can the system resist corruption, bribery, gaming, etc.? And we'll get to the next one.
Well, the first one is to bribe somebody, you need to figure out whom to bribe. And one of
Yeah.
the whole points of the design is that there is no central point. There's the adjudication is decentralized, the source and destination are decentralized. So it's not at all obvious whom you would seek to corrupt. Because by design, there's no center here. It's just a system of rights that listeners and speakers enforce on their own behalf. So it gets by design, it's really hard to try to corrupt the center of the system. There isn't a center of the system. All right, so I guess the next question is on Gen AI.
I mean, sorry, before you leave that though, Marshall, but I mean, what does the future look like? Are there medallions? Are there some types of scores on comments that are certifications? And if so, can you hack it? Maybe is the corollary to bribery.
So could you would need indicia that would be hard to forge, but those are the same kinds of things that you would want, in a Venmo transaction. If it's hard to forge a Venmo transaction, then it would be hard to forge one of these. You simply need that same kind of technology.
Yes.
Is it possible? Sure. Is it worth it? Probably not. We just have to make the cost high enough that it's not worth it in this instance. So I think that's a problem that we faced before. I think we can handle that one.
I guess you were going to go to the second part, which you're seeing, and I'll just read. In the age of generative AI, when fact-checking quality may be affected by the tools used to generate and fact-check content, how should the proposed mechanism be modified, if any?
So a couple of thoughts there. One of these, I grant that the discerning truth is getting harder and harder and harder as generative AI makes it more and more difficult to discern what happened and what didn't happen. You can now make almost any person, any politician appear to have said or did something that they never even thought about doing, let alone actually having done. I would push back to the point that I would say that's going to be true for any mechanism at all. You're always going to have to decide what's true and what's not true. And I really think what we really need to do is to balance the weighted sum of false positives and false negatives for any kind of adjudication mechanism. How often was something false when it really was true? Did you think it was? Or how often was it true when you decided it was false? So false positives and false negatives. So I think we need to balance those mechanisms and comparing this to a bunch of the other mechanisms, whether it's having the center do it, whether it's having technology do it, whether it's ex post having users do it via crouching. This seems to be better at false positives and false negatives than other mechanisms. Is it perfect? No, I would never claim that. We can't know truth absolutely, but is it better on false positives and false negatives? On average, I think it is.
About that Gen AI, she asked about the fact-checking quality being affected, and I work, with a lot of people who are working in fact-checking, and I'd have to say it isn't being affected at all. They are slowly introducing tools. The trouble with using AI to fact-check is you've immediately you cannot be transparent because no one knows how those neural nets work. You have to have real humans to be independently verifiable in your fact check. But you can assist name entity recognition and things like that. Gen AI is actually one of the biggest problems in misinformation right now. Hundreds of sites, maybe even thousands by now, that are almost entirely produced by a Gen AI, and they have almost no traffic, so it really doesn't matter. But that's not quite how it works. All they do is generate something that gets picked up, it gets amplified. But there is, to me, the trouble with AI is the loss of attribution. That's the trouble with social media, the loss of attribution. We post something, it looks good, we say it comes from there, and there's no link. It's of no use except that everybody uses it. So
I would
There's
add to
one
the
company,
problem.
I just want to say there's one company in Norway, Factiverse, who has made some real dent in that. And they are able to take text and identify the source. That was from the Washington Post. This was from, the BBC. And at first it was just like the words themselves seemed to be, but now they are able to identify the concept in the language and take a really good guess at its original source, just the opposite of AI, using AI to go the other way. And that's really, for fact checkers, I think, and for maybe the public, that's really a big step forward.
Well, I would add one thing to your saying in agreement, effectively saying that Gen AI is going to make this even tougher. And as you use technology, it becomes an arms race. So you're using
Right.
technology to detect it. So you're using technology to avoid the detection and using the next generation to detect that. And it becomes an arms race. And really, one of the things I would hope we could try to do is step aside from the arms race and use a mechanism design to get out of that kind of trap, intellectual trap, to find better ways to address this problem and curb the misinformation. So I'm hoping we can use mechanism design as information signaling and screening as mechanisms to try to separate fact from fiction.
It's very much like the cybersecurity race. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a constant race. And in cybersecurity, they use machines. So the white hats have to use machines too to fight it. And that's true of misinformation. There are people using machines all the time, and this cannot be fought without machines and algorithms.
Fascinating. So Marshall, playing on your wonderful metaphor of the polluted ecosystem of media in general, but social media specifically, um, kind of his final wrap up in words from each of you. What's the outlook? What's the outlook 5, 10 years? I mean, are you optimistic, Barrett, or you think it's just going to crash and burn, or what do you think?
I don't try and predict the future. I think humans are really bad at it, and I'm a human, so I don't predict. Sorry.
Marshall, any?
I'm going to take a stab at it. So, if we look back, and I want to use history as a kind of lens on the future. If we look back at the pollution problem from the industrial era, we had smog. If you look at Pittsburgh, I don't know, you can still see the smog on the buildings and some of the, in the steel manufacturer. It took a really, really, we got giant monopoly scale firms back in the industrial era, in steel, in railroad, in electricity, in coal, um, in automotive. We're seeing that same kind of thing today. We had a pollution problem in those days. We had labor problems in those days. And it took a while for us to develop the systems and the rules and the understanding in order to adjust our laws and ecosystems to make it work. I think our information pollution problems today are analogous to industrial pollution problems we got a century to a century and a half ago. And it's going to take us better theories, better mechanisms to deal with these very same kinds of issues the way we did with those a century ago. But I do think we'll get there. I'm optimistic. I don't know. It's a different question. Will I see this in my lifetime? I'm not going to make a bet on that. But are we going to get there? Well, I'm hoping we can. I mean, in some ways, that's what we're trying to do with the research at BU.
Yes.
Can we come up with better tools? Can we come up with better theories to actually get us past this pollution problem? I think we did it a century ago. I'm optimistic we can do it now.
You're relatively optimistic very optimistic on the capacity of mankind, humankind to self-regulate, right?
Can I interject one thing for people to think about? There's some sort of belief out there that misinformation is worse now than it has ever been. That is absolutely not a provable fact. 100 years ago, newspapers were owned by, they've
By the
come along, they
railroads.
were owned by people who had owned, were of a particular party, and that's all they were supposed to do. I've not seen data that says that. The proportion, I'm not saying the volume, I'm saying the proportion, because the proportion of information has increased. So, but I think we attack this like this is some sort of flood that we haven't seen before. I don't have that data. There's this guy, I can't even pronounce his last name, Joe somebody, begins with a U, down in Miami. He has data that states the opposite, that it's pretty constant and has been for about 100 years, the amount of misinformation. So I just want to, what's the word, disenthrall people of
Yeah,
that idea
sure.
that it's worse now than it's ever been. It probably, if I was going to guess, about the same.
And distributed leaflets, I'm sure, had the same amount of outrageous claims, right? Well, thank you both for your insights and comments, and encourage everyone to see truthmarket.com, right? For the platform governance research lab, that work that's being done by Marshall and his team. And Barrett, thank you so much for joining us. And Marshall, appreciate all your work and efforts. And we missed Nina having her with us today, but we will catch it next time.
Well, and if folks want more information, our working papers will be available at Digital Business Institute or at truthmarket.com. So very happy to have folks you take a look at that research. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear feedback. Again, the only way we're going to solve this problem is getting better ideas. And if ours are terrible, we'd like to know about it and improve them. If you have better ideas, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
everybody. Appreciate it. Bye now.